Before the guillotine could claim her, Marie Antoinette endured 76 days of calculated psychological warfare designed to strip away not just her crown, but her sanity, her motherhood, and her very sense of self. What history remembers as a swift execution was actually the final act of a months-long campaign to break a woman so completely that even death would seem merciful. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. In those final days, imprisoned in a cell where two guards watched her every movement, even as she dressed behind a rotting screen, even as she bled through her clothes from cervical cancer no one would treat, Marie Antoinette discovered something her captors never anticipated. When you have nothing left to lose, you become impossible to destroy. This is the hidden truth of Marie Antoinette's final days. Not the legend of a frivolous queen who said, "Let them eat cake," but the documented reality of a dying woman who faced systematic humiliation with such unexpected dignity that even her executioners would later speak of it with something approaching awe. Forget the glittering halls of Versailles. Forget the gossip about diamond necklaces and extravagant hairstyles. By August 1793, Marie Antoinette was already a ghost. She had watched her husband Louis XVI ride to his execution 9 months earlier. She had been imprisoned with her children in the Temple Tower, a medieval fortress that became their cage. And on the night of August 1st, in what would become her defining trauma, she experienced something worse than any guillotine. Revolutionary guards stormed into her room at 2 a.m. They had come for her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, the boy who was now, in royalist eyes, the King of France. The Republic could not allow him to remain with his mother. Contemporary accounts describe Marie Antoinette throwing herself between the guards and her son. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, 15 years old, clung to her little brother, screaming. The boy himself wrapped his arms around his mother's neck, begging them not to separate them. It took over an hour of pleading, of physical struggle, of a mother fighting with everything she had. When they finally tore him away, Marie Antoinette collapsed. The guards had to carry her back to her bed. She would never see him again. And within months, subjected to horrific abuse and interrogation, Louis Charles would be dead. That night, Marie Antoinette's hair, already graying from stress, began to turn completely white. She was 37 years old. 2 nights later, at 2 a.m. again, they always came at 2 a.m., guards arrived to take Marie Antoinette from the Temple Tower. Her destination was the Conciergerie, the grim stone fortress on the Ile de la Cité that Parisians called the antechamber to the guillotine. She was no longer addressed as Madame, or even by her name. She was prisoner number 280. The cell they gave her was 12 feet by 10 feet. The walls wept with moisture. A straw mattress crawling with vermin served as her bed. A single barred window, too high to see through, provided the only light. The air stank of mold and human waste from the sewers that ran beneath the prison. But here's what makes this particularly cruel. She was never alone. 2 guards, members of the Revolutionary Gendarmerie, were stationed inside her cell 24 hours a day. They sat 3 feet from her bed. They watched her eat, watched her use the chamber pot, watched her attempt to change her clothes behind a flimsy screen that provided no real privacy. When she tried to sleep, they talked loudly, laughed, smoked pipes. One guard, a man named Gilbert, would later testify that he was ordered to observe the prisoner constantly to prevent suicide or escape. But the real purpose was psychological, to strip away every last shred of dignity, to break her before they killed her. Marie Antoinette was also dying. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms recorded by her maid, Rosalie Lamorlière, indicates she was suffering from advanced cervical cancer. She hemorrhaged constantly, bleeding through her clothes. The guards reported this to their superiors. No doctor was sent. She requested clean undergarments. The request was denied. She asked for warmer clothing as autumn approached. Denied. She begged for news of her children. Silence. Rosalie, a simple servant girl who had no reason to love the former queen, would later write, I have never seen such suffering borne with such patience. She never complained. She never wept in front of the guards. Only when I was alone with her, changing her bedding, would she sometimes whisper questions about her children. The revolutionaries had invented a new form of torture. Not physical violence, but the complete erasure of privacy, comfort, and hope. On October 12, 1793, Marie Antoinette received notice that her trial would begin in 2 days. Unlike her husband, who had been given 3 weeks to prepare a defense and access to lawyers, she was given 48 hours and one appointed attorney, who met her for the first time the night before the trial. The trial began at 8 a.m. on October 14th in the Hall of Liberty of the Revolutionary Tribunal. The chamber was packed with spectators, mostly women who had come to watch the former queen's humiliation. Marie Antoinette was brought in wearing a simple black dress, the mourning clothes she had worn since Louis XV's death. The president of the tribunal, Marshal Herman, read the charges: treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, theft of state funds, organizing orgies at Versailles. The accusations were a mixture of politics and pornography, drawn from the same gutter pamphlets that had circulated about her for years. Marie Antoinette responded calmly to each charge, her voice steady despite her physical weakness. Yes, she had communicated with her family in Austria. She was Austrian. No, she had not stolen money. The king's finances were a matter of record. The orgies? Fantasies invented by people who had never set foot in Versailles. The trial dragged on for 16 hours. Marie Antoinette was not allowed to sit, except during brief recesses. She stood, bleeding, exhausted, facing her accusers with a composure that clearly frustrated them. Then, on the trial's second day, the prosecutor Jacques-René Hébert, a man who published the most vicious pornographic attacks on Marie Antoinette in his newspaper, made his move. He announced a new charge, one so shocking that even some revolutionaries shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Incest. With her own son. They had forced 8-year-old Louis Charles, after weeks of interrogation and abuse, to sign a statement claiming his mother had sexually abused him. The courtroom erupted in gasps and shouts. The revolutionary women in the gallery, who had come to jeer, fell silent. For the first time, Marie Antoinette seemed to break. She stood frozen, her face drained of color. When the judge demanded she respond to this accusation, she said nothing. The silence stretched out. Hébert smiled, thinking he had finally destroyed her. Then Marie Antoinette did something extraordinary. She turned away from the judges and faced the gallery. She looked directly at the women of Paris, who had screamed for her death. And she spoke. If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. I appeal to all mothers present. The women in the gallery, market women, laundresses, revolutionaries, began to murmur. Some wept. Even in the middle of revolutionary fervor, even among people who wanted her dead, the accusation had gone too far. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about destroying a mother's most fundamental bond. Hébert had overplayed his hand. Years later, even Robespierre would criticize him for it, saying it had turned public opinion momentarily in Marie Antoinette's favor. But it didn't matter. The verdict was already written. After 2 days of show trial, the jury of 12 men deliberated for just over an hour, guilty on all charges. Sentence: death by guillotine. Execution: the next morning. When asked if she had anything to say, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head. Marie Antoinette was returned to her cell at 4 a.m. on October 16, 1793. She had approximately 8 hours to live. She refused the meal the guards offered. Rosalie later recalled, "She told me, 'I need nothing now, my child. Everything is over for me.'" But that wasn't quite true. Marie Antoinette had one final act to complete. By candlelight, sitting at the small table in her cell while the guards watched, she wrote a letter. Not to her daughter, though Marie-Thérèse was alive and in the same prison complex. She knew any letter to her daughter would be intercepted and read aloud in public, used as propaganda. Instead, she wrote to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, who was also imprisoned. The letter is one of the most heartbreaking documents in history. In it, Marie Antoinette did not proclaim her innocence or rage against injustice. Instead, she wrote about her children. I die in the Catholic faith of my fathers. I ask forgiveness of all those I know, and especially you, my sister, for any pain I may have caused. I ask my son, if he should see this letter, to forgive those who have brought about his mother's death. She begged Elizabeth to make sure Louis Charles understood that the testimony he had been forced to give was not his fault. She described her son as so young and tender that he could not have known what he was doing. The letter was sealed and given to a guard. He pocketed it and never delivered it. The letter wouldn't surface until 1816, hidden in the private papers of a revolutionary official. Marie Antoinette never knew her final words to her family would be lost for 23 years. At dawn, the guards told her to prepare. What happened next was another deliberate cruelty. They ordered her to remove her black mourning dress, the last garment that connected her to her identity as Louis XV's widow. In its place, they gave her a plain white chemise, the kind worn by common criminals on their way to execution. She asked for privacy to change. The guards laughed. They had watched her for 76 days. Why stop now? Marie Antoinette turned her back to them and changed as quickly as her weak, bleeding body would allow. Then came the hair. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, and his assistant arrived with scissors. Marie Antoinette's hair, once her crowning glory, styled in elaborate creations that set European fashion, was now completely white, thin, brittle. It didn't matter. They cut it off roughly at the nape of her neck. The hair wasn't saved for her family. It was kept as a souvenir. Next, the binding. Her hands were pulled behind her back and tied with coarse rope, pulled so tight that her shoulders were wrenched. When she gasped in pain, one of the assistants sneered, "Not so delicate now, are you?" There was one final humiliation. Marie Antoinette, still hemorrhaging, asked to be allowed to change her bloodied underclothes one last time. A simple request for basic dignity. The guards refused. She would ride through Paris to her execution bleeding through her white dress, visible to everyone. At 11 a.m., Marie Antoinette was led out into the courtyard of the conciergerie. Waiting for her was a two-wheeled wooden cart called a tumbril, the kind used to haul refuse and criminals. Her husband, Louis XVI, had been granted a closed carriage for his execution. Marie Antoinette was denied even that small mercy. An artist named Jacques-Louis David, one of the revolution's most passionate supporters, was waiting in the courtyard. He sketched her as she climbed into the cart. That sketch survives today, and it's haunting. It shows a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, her white hair barely covered by a cap, her hands bound behind her. But what David captured, perhaps unintentionally, was her expression, not fear, not despair, something closer to defiant resignation. The cart lurched forward, and the procession to the Place de la Révolution began. The route was over a mile long, designed to pass through the most crowded streets of Paris. An estimated 30,000 people lined the route, some to cheer, some to jeer, some simply to witness history. Marie Antoinette sat on a wooden plank, her back straight, despite having no hands to balance with. Every jolt of the cart on the cobblestones was agony. Remember, she was dying of cervical cancer, hemorrhaging, exhausted from 2 days of trial without sleep. The crowd's mood was volatile. Some shouted, "Death to the Austrian," others spat as the cart passed. But here's what multiple witnesses recorded. Marie Antoinette never looked down. She stared straight ahead, her face a mask of composure. She didn't weep, she didn't plead, she didn't acknowledge the insults. A priest, one of the constitutional clergy approved by the revolution, rode in the cart with her, offering religious comfort. Marie Antoinette refused to speak to him. She considered him a traitor to the Catholic faith. Even now, facing death, she would not compromise her beliefs for comfort. The journey took over an hour. By the time the cart reached the Place de la Révolution, formerly Place Louis XV, now the site of the guillotine, Marie Antoinette had endured more than most people could imagine. But her ordeal wasn't over. The worst and the best was still to come. The guillotine stood in the center of the square, its blade glinting in the October sun. The crowd here was even larger, perhaps 50,000 people pressed into every available space. They had come to see the former Queen of France die. The cart stopped. Sanson, the executioner, stepped forward to help Marie Antoinette down. She refused his hand. Despite her bound hands, despite her weakness, despite the pain, she climbed down from the cart by herself. And then came the stairs. 15 wooden steps led up to the platform where the guillotine waited. This was the moment the crowd expected her to break. This was when prisoners typically collapsed, or had to be dragged, or screamed. Marie Antoinette walked up those stairs faster than Sanson expected. He had to hurry to keep pace with her. Contemporary accounts describe her as almost running up the steps, as if eager to end the ordeal, to escape her broken body and the hatred that surrounded her. At the top of the platform, she could see the full scope of the crowd, thousands of faces all watching her. The revolutionary officials in their tricolor sashes, the women who had once served her at Versailles, now too terrified or too ashamed to show themselves. The masses who had blamed her for bread shortages and royal excess. She could also see the guillotine's lunette, the wooden frame where her neck would be placed, the plank where she would lie face down, the wicker basket positioned to catch her severed head. And then, in the middle of this tableau of death and hatred, Marie Antoinette did something that stunned everyone present. She stepped on Sanson's foot. The executioner, a man who had personally beheaded hundreds of people during the Terror, flinched. The crowd, poised for the final moment, froze. And Marie Antoinette, widow of a king, mother of stolen children, dying of cancer, humiliated for months, turned to the man who would kill her in seconds and whispered, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." She had apologized, to her executioner, for accidentally stepping on his foot. It was such a small thing, such a human thing. A reflex of courtesy from a life that had drilled manners into her since she was a child in Vienna. But in that context, in that moment, it became something else entirely. It was a final assertion of her humanity, a reminder that beneath all the propaganda, all the titles, all the revolutionary rage, she was simply a person, capable of small kindness even at the threshold of death. Several witnesses recorded that the crowd fell suddenly quiet. The jeering stopped. Some people later claimed they felt ashamed, though that didn't stop them from watching what came next. Sanson recovered quickly. He positioned Marie Antoinette at the guillotine's plank. She knelt, then laid face down. Her neck was placed in the bottom half of the lunette. The top half closed over it, holding her in position. The assistant executioners stepped back. Sanson checked the blade one final time, then pulled the release. At exactly 12:15 p.m. on October 16, 1793, the blade fell. It took less than a second. Marie Antoinette, the last Queen of France, was dead. Sanson's assistant immediately grabbed her severed head by the hair and held it aloft to show the crowd. The square erupted. "Vive la République!" people screamed. "Long live the Republic!" Hats flew into the air. Some people danced, others wept with joy. The execution had taken 4 minutes from the moment she stepped off the cart. The procession of humiliation had taken 76 days. Marie Antoinette's body was immediately thrown into the cart, her head tossed beside it. There would be no royal funeral, no lying in state, no public mourning. She was taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, a pauper's burial ground near the Place de la Révolution. There, without ceremony, her body was thrown into a mass grave and covered with quicklime to speed decomposition. The grave wasn't marked. No stone, no cross, no name. In death, as in her final months of life, the revolution attempted to erase her completely. But they made a mistake. They kept records. The cemetery keeper, Pierre-Louis Olivier Desclozeaux, noted the burial in his ledger. October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette of Austria, aged 37 years, widow of the former king, executed this day at noon, buried at approximately 3 p.m. in the cemetery of the Madeleine. That note, that simple bureaucratic record, would ensure she could never be truly erased. In the hours after the execution, Paris went about its business. The guillotine was cleaned, ready for the next batch of condemned. The crowd dispersed. Revolutionary newspapers praised the execution as justice served. The Austrian woman, they wrote, had finally paid for her crimes against the French people. But something unexpected began to happen. Stories started circulating, not from royalists or counter-revolutionaries, but from ordinary witnesses who had watched the execution. They talked about the apology, about how she had walked up those stairs, about the look on her face, not fearful but composed, about how thin she had been, how white her hair was, how obviously ill. A woman who had been in the crowd told her daughter, "I went to cheer, but when I saw her I felt only pity. She looked like my mother dying of the same disease. Whatever she did as queen, no one deserves that." Others remembered the incest accusation at her trial, how she had appealed to the mothers in the courtroom, how even in the face of the most vile charge imaginable, she had maintained her dignity. The revolution had wanted to create a spectacle of justice. They had wanted to show that royalty could be brought low, that privilege offered no protection from the people's wrath. And they had succeeded, but they had also inadvertently created a martyr. Marie Antoinette's maid, Rosalie Lamorlière, was questioned extensively after the execution. They wanted to know if the queen had tried to escape, if she had hidden messages, if she had plotted. Rosalie told them the truth. She prayed. She asked about her children. She endured. That testimony was supposed to be damning. It became instead a record of quiet dignity under impossible circumstances. Then there were the objects. A young woman named Marie Grossholtz, who would later become famous as Madame Tussaud, was called to make a death mask of Marie Antoinette's severed head. It was meant to be a revolutionary trophy, proof of the Queen's execution. But when Grossholtz looked at the face, she saw something that haunted her for the rest of her life. Her features, Tussaud later wrote, were perfectly composed. Even in death, there was a serenity about her expression. "I have made death masks of many executed people. Most show fear or agony. Hers showed peace." That death mask still exists today, preserved in museums, a silent witness to Marie Antoinette's final moments. 22 years passed. The revolution consumed itself in blood and terror. Robespierre, who had signed Marie Antoinette's death warrant, was himself guillotined. Napoleon rose and fell. And finally, in 1815, the Bourbon monarchy was restored to France. One of the first acts of the new king, Louis XVI, younger brother of Louis XVI, was to find his brother and sister-in-law's remains. He hired Pierre-Louis Olivier Desclozeaux, the cemetery keeper who had buried them, to locate the graves. On January 18, 1815, in the presence of the new king, workers began excavating the site of the old Madeleine cemetery. They found what they were looking for, 2 skeletons buried with quicklime. The remains were identified by the clothing fragments that had survived. Marie Antoinette's garter was still intact, embroidered with her initials. The remains were exhumed with full royal honors and transported to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French monarchs. On January 21, 1815, 22 years to the day after Louis XVI's execution, Marie Antoinette was finally laid to rest with the ceremony and dignity that had been denied her in death. Today, her tomb lies beside her husband's in Saint-Denis. Visitors come from around the world to see it. The inscription is simple: Marie Antoinette of Austria, Queen of France. But here's what's remarkable. Most visitors don't come because she was a queen. They come because of how she died. Because her story, despite every attempt to erase it, survived. Because the humiliations she endured and the dignity she maintained in the face of them became more powerful than any propaganda. The hidden truth of Marie Antoinette's final days is not what the revolutionaries wanted us to remember, and it's not what royalist hagiographers later claimed either. She was not a saint. She had been a privileged woman who lived in obscene luxury while people starved. She had made political mistakes. She had been tone-deaf to the suffering of her subjects. History's judgment of her as a queen is complicated and deservedly so. But that's not what her final 76 days were about. The revolutionaries didn't execute her because of bread shortages or political alliances. They executed her because she was a symbol. And before they executed her, they tried to destroy that symbol completely. To show the world that royalty was just flesh and blood, that queens could be reduced to bleeding, suffering animals. What they discovered instead was something they hadn't anticipated, that when you strip away everything, crown, clothing, privacy, health, children, hope, what remains is the core of a human being, and that core cannot be destroyed by humiliation. Marie Antoinette didn't become a legend because she was regal on the scaffold. She became a legend because she was human. She apologized for stepping on someone's foot. She worried about her children. She maintained small courtesies in the face of massive cruelty. They wanted her to break. They needed her to break. Because if the former Queen of France could be reduced to a screaming, pleading wretch, it would validate everything the revolution stood for. It would prove that nobility was just a costume, easily removed. She didn't give them that, not because she was superhuman, but because she had already lost everything that mattered to her. Her husband was dead, her children were taken, her body was failing. What was a guillotine compared to that? In her final letter, the one that was intercepted and hidden for 23 years, Marie Antoinette wrote something that reveals the hidden truth of her final days. I am calm, as one is when one's conscience reproaches one with nothing. She didn't claim to be innocent of all charges. She didn't rail against the injustice of her trial. She simply stated that she had done her best, that she had been a mother who loved her children, a woman who had maintained her faith and her basic human decency, even when everything else was taken from her. That was the hidden truth they tried to bury with her in that unmarked grave. That dignity is not something that can be given by titles or taken away by force. It's something you either choose to maintain or choose to surrender. Marie Antoinette chose to maintain it, all the way up those 15 wooden steps, all the way to the moment the blade fell. The guillotine was designed to be humane, a quick death that didn't distinguish between noble and commoner. In that, it succeeded. Marie Antoinette died exactly as thousands of others died during the Terror. But the 76 days before the blade fell, that was where the revolution showed its true face. Not in the execution, but in the systematic attempt to break a human being's spirit before ending their life. They failed. The woman who climbed onto that scaffold at 12:15 p.m. on October 16, 1793, was not the frivolous queen of legend. She was not the martyr of royalist fantasy. She was a dying woman who had endured unimaginable psychological torture and had somehow maintained enough of herself to apologize for stepping on someone's foot. That small act of courtesy, witnessed by thousands, recorded by multiple sources, and debated by historians for over 2 centuries, contains the entire truth of Marie Antoinette's final days. They could take her crown. They could take her children. They could take her health, her privacy, and finally her life. But they could not take the small, stubborn core of humanity that made her capable of saying, "Pardon me," to the man who was about to kill her. The guillotine was swift. The humiliation was designed to be eternal. But what endured was neither the violence nor the degradation. What endured was a moment of unexpected grace, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest chapters, even on the steps of a guillotine, we still have the power to choose how we face the end. Marie Antoinette made her choice, and in doing so, she transformed her execution from a revolutionary triumph into something far more complex, a testament to the resilience of human dignity. If this hidden truth moved you, if you found yourself seeing Marie Antoinette not as a legend, but as a human being facing impossible circumstances, leave a comment below. Tell us what surprised you most about her final days. And if you want to uncover more hidden truths from history, the documented realities that propaganda and legend have buried, subscribe to Grim History. Because the real stories of how people face their darkest moments are always more powerful than the myths we tell about them. The truth is never simple, but it's always worth remembering.